With all the hundreds of AI tools cropping up recently, we're seeing AI being used in podcasting in all sorts of ways. But is this helping podcasters or harming them? In this video, I'm going to share the do's and don'ts of using AI in podcasting. I've got 4 ways of using AI in your podcast production process while keeping that human connection intact, and then 3 ways that I don't recommend using AI in your podcast process. The first do for using AI in podcasting is when planning your launch. So if you're just launching your podcast now, especially if you're going alone, then generative AI tools like ChatGPT can be useful for bouncing ideas around for things like naming your podcast, which format you should use for your podcast, and more. It's a great brainstorming tool. And to use this in a way that's actually useful, it requires a lot of information up front. So you first want to really get a good idea, as I'd recommend with any podcast launch, of who your ideal listener is, what are their pain points, what are their challenges, where are they in life, what kind of existing knowledge do they have on whatever topic you're going to be podcasting about. Just really get a good understanding of who you're targeting. This is going to be important for any decision you make going forward in your podcast, not just for using AI for launching. And then also having a really good understanding of why you're podcasting, like what you want to get out of it exactly. And once you have all this information, you can feed that into ChatGPT, and then with the right prompt, you can get it to give you some ideas. Or maybe you already have some ideas for a podcast name, but maybe they've been taken, or maybe you're not 100% sure on them. So the way that you could use ChatGPT to bounce around some more ideas, you could use a prompt that asks first what you want from it. So I want you to give me 10 names that I could use for my podcast. Then you want to give it some boundaries. So let it know what should and shouldn't be in a podcast name. For example, I want it to be between 1 and 4 words. It shouldn't have any swearing in. It shouldn't have any special characters. It should be catchy, but also be clear of exactly what the content is about. And once you've given it those boundaries, then you can dump in all that information you've got about your ideal listener and what they want, what their pain points are, and so on. And then you should get a few pretty good ideas from ChatGPT for names. But to make sure you're keeping that human touch, you need to use these as a guideline rather than just grabbing a name and being done with it. Think about which of these names will really resonate with your audience. Maybe it will give you an idea for a name, and then you'll be able to come up with something off the back of ChatGPT's suggestions. And of course, make sure that you check all of the podcast apps. You do Google searches, YouTube searches, and so on, and make sure that name is available. And then you can use similar prompts for coming up with the description for your podcast as well. If you stay in that same chat on ChatGPT, it will have all that information about your ideal listener, and you can give it a format that you want the podcast description to be in, and then it can help generate or rewrite descriptions if you're not 100% sure on them. So the first don't is don't rely on AI for podcast editing. There are a bunch of tools out there that edit your podcast for you, basically, in different ways. So some tools will automatically cut out all the dead air and the ums and ahs and things. Descript, for example, has tools that allow you to do this. Others, Descript included, Riverside also has a new feature that allows you to do this. It will give you a script. It will give you a transcription of the whole podcast episode that you uploaded, and they'll be able to cut parts out using that and make use of the AI tools for cutting out dead air and stuff automatically. So it can be useful. Like, it's often better than nothing. If you can't edit, if you don't have time to edit at all or anything like that, then still the AI cutting out the filler words and the dead air and so on can be useful. But the problem is, it's just not accurate enough to make a professional result. If you're doing this as a hobby and you just don't have the time or money, then it might be worth giving it a go. But if you want a quality result, it's not super accurate at how it cuts things. It often cuts off words sort of either side of the and the or the dead air. It cuts things that it thinks are filler words but actually aren't. It can often add artifacts as well, so weird sort of noises and things that weren't there to begin with. And also it doesn't understand pace and tone and how to craft a great listening experience for your ideal listener. There's more to editing than just cutting out ums and ahs and dead air. It's also about removing things that aren't going to give value to the listener, moving things around, making sure that the beginning of the episode's really punchy and gets straight into the value. And these are things that, as of yet, I haven't seen an AI editing tool that can do this. So as a better alternative, I would personally just go through this yourself. Even if you don't have time to do a full detailed edit, or you don't have the budget to pass it off to somebody else and you can't sort of get all the ums and ahs out and dead air, it's still better to have that human touch and really think about what's going to give value to your ideal listener than just letting an AI do it. Or if you are going to use an AI tool like Descript to edit, or Adobe Audio Enhance to improve the sound quality, at least make sure you're going through it afterwards, doing a human edit, or just checking through the whole thing before publishing it. Do use AI for coming up with episode ideas. This is especially useful if you're hosting a solo or co-hosted podcast. So once you've already launched your podcast and you've given ChatGPT all that information, I'm sure you're going to be able to think of plenty of things, plenty of episode ideas that will give your audience a huge amount of value based on your expertise and knowledge around the subject. But I know it can be difficult, especially after you've been podcasting for a few months or even a few years. It can be difficult and quite time consuming to try and think of all of the ideas for every episode, especially if you're putting out an episode every week or more than once a week. So for brainstorming, again, ChatGPT can be useful. You can ask it to give you a list of episode ideas around the topics that you know are going to be useful for your audience. And often the thing with these tools is you're not going to be using exactly what it gives you a lot of the time, but it can help to be prompted and then often helps you think of your own ideas. And again, this is especially useful if you're going solo. But again, for the human touch, just make sure you're really thinking about what your ideal listener wants to hear. Have you covered this topic before? Does this topic need covering more? And so on, because that AI doesn't truly know your audience like you do. Next, it's don't use AI for voice synthesis. There are a lot of tools now like Google's Notebook LM and other tools that will generate voice recordings for you. Like you can put in a transcript or a script for your episode, and then it will literally just read through it and you'll get an MP3 or WAV file back, and you can just upload that as your podcast rather than having to speak yourself. But they never sound great. Like, I'm sure at some point we'll get to the point where it does sound like a real human, but even then, podcasts are about real connection. The ones that do really well, especially from what I've seen from our clients, the ones that do well, that build a loyal following, are the ones where the audience is building a real connection with the host. And it's impossible to build a real connection with an AI voice. I know there are certain podcasts where it's just about sort of reading historical facts and things like that, where an AI voice could be maybe a little bit more useful than, say, an opinion piece. But even then, podcast listeners choose to keep listening to particular podcasts because of the connection that they form with the host. If there are 1,000 podcasts out there on a particular topic, are your ideal listeners really going to choose the boring AI voice over the human with their own opinions, their own personality that gels with the listener? Highly unlikely. As an exception, if you or a guest have misspoken a single word, and you can use an AI tool to generate that word to replace it because for whatever reason you're not in a position to re-record, then I don't see any problem with that personally. But I wouldn't go any further than that personally. At best, AI-read podcasts are kind of boring. At worst, it can just turn into a mess. Like, for example, one of my clients, she wanted to save some time and money getting her book read by one of these AI voice tools. And it sounded okay, but it came back with a bunch of horrible random noises. Like every few sentences, it would just randomly go like, ha! And she ended up having to get an editor to go through the whole thing anyway, in which case it probably would have been easier and cheaper just to record the thing from scratch, and she would have gotten a better result out of it. All right, we got 3 more. So the next do is use AI for transcriptions. AI transcription tools like Otter AI can save you so much time by turning your podcast episodes into text. Now, if you're using these transcriptions for accessibility, if you're using them for SEO purposes to just get the copy onto your website as a blog post, then transcriptions can be really useful. But listening through the whole thing and typing out every word of your podcast is a massive feat, especially if you want to do it for every episode. So even though these transcription tools aren't perfect, they can save you a huge amount of time. And then for captions too, if you're captioning shorts and things, if you're using DaVinci Resolve CapCut, they'll automatically write out the captions for you. But the human touch side of this is that you need to go through and edit them. Because if you use Otter AI or something like that, it's going to get you about 80% of the way there. But you'll need to go through and fix the names, the proper nouns, the positioning, and some of the words, make sure it's in the correct dialect and things like that. So if you're regularly doing transcriptions or captions, I'd recommend using AI. Just make sure that you go through them all yourself after. The last don't is just be really careful when you're using AI for sensitive topics, or just don't use it at all. Because there is so much nuance when you're talking about things like health, ethics, D&I topics, things like that. It doesn't really understand the nuance. It can be very biased, a lot of these AI tools, and it could just be plain wrong. It links to the same things we were talking about using AI voices. It's just even more important when you're using it for sensitive topics to avoid this. When in doubt, just trust your own judgment and really think about your ideal listener. AI can be used as a tool, but not as a replacement for human wisdom and insight. And lastly, the final do is do use AI for note-taking. So if you're recording interviews online, especially if you're using Zoom or Riverside, then AI tools can be really useful for taking notes while you're recording the episode so that you don't have to after. So for example, Zoom has a built-in note taker. You just click a button before you hit record, and then it will basically summarize the whole conversation after for you. So you don't have to have like scribbling and typing. You can stay fully present in the conversation. It doesn't affect the recording, the audio in any way as well. And then you can use those summaries to then write your show notes, whether you're using ChatGPT to write a framework and then going through it, or just writing them yourself. For me, I sometimes use these and just have those notes there just in case I forget something we covered. And then I just straight after the call, I go onto Google Docs and I'll just type out the show notes. But then I have those AI generated notes there just for when I'm writing a list of all the topics we covered, just in case I forget anything. And for the human touch, you can probably imagine, I just don't recommend copying and pasting these notes verbatim into your show notes. I recommend writing them yourself, or at least rewriting them, because again, AI doesn't really understand what your ideal listener wants. And it's also not that great at capturing the attention when it comes to show notes. And it can often speak quite clinically, kind of corporate and a bit boring and repetitive. So going through it yourself is essential. So should you use AI for podcasting? Well, if you're mindful of your ideal listener, and if you're not tempted to jump on every single AI tool that crops up, then I'd recommend using it in some instances, but always retaining that human touch. It's still very new technology, and if in doubt, keep it human. Just think about every time you make a decision on podcast, is this what's best for my ideal listener in delivering them as much value as possible? Or is this just saving me a little bit of time? Because if it's the latter, then maybe it's worth saving time in other areas of your podcast, but making sure that all of the content you do put out there is retaining that human connection and is giving as much value as possible. And let me know in the comments below, are you using AI anywhere in your podcasting workflow? And for more podcasting tips and tutorials, hit that subscribe button. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.